Possiamo iniziare? Sì. Buonasera a tutti, grazie di essere venuti. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the Perugia Journalism Festival for inviting us. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? Yeah. And thank you to our great panelists for joining us here tonight. Just a quick note. As you've probably seen in other panels, we're not allowed to take questions directly from the audience, but we very much hope that you do have questions. So if you can, please DM me on Twitter. I'm going to check for messages, and I'll ask those questions for you. Let's start, I guess. My name is Alice Speri. I'm a reporter at the Intercept, where I cover US foreign policy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Intercept, but we are very much a product of the war on terror. I'd like to think one of the good products of the war on terror, if such a thing can really exist. We were founded in 2014, initially as a space to report primarily on the revelations made possible by NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. And the war on terror has since then always been essential to our DNA and to what we do as a publication. At the core of our mission then and now was always this idea that we need to challenge the nearly absolute lack of transparency and accountability that has defined the US government's actions in the aftermath of 9/11. And over the years, we have covered countless aspects of the war on terror, from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to wars, many covert ones, in countries that get much less coverage, to wars the US was directly involved in or involved in varying ways. We also covered wars where the language of the war on terror and the rhetoric of the war on terror was copied and exploited to abuse civilians, political dissenters, or to anyone else that someone in a position of power decided to label a terrorist. At The Intercept, we've stayed on this story, and we've covered the reach of the war on terror, and we plan to continue to do so. But we also especially covered the ways in which the war on terror defined the lives of Americans and non-citizens living in the United States. Mass surveillance, targeting of activism and dissent, racial and religious discrimination, but also the transformation of our own institutions, from the militarization of American police to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which did not exist before 9/11, including Border Patrol and ICE, to subunits of it that are really the domestic arm of the war on terror. We covered the indefinite detention of immigrants, the separation of children from their parents on the US-Mexico border, and I think all of this and so much more can be understood as an element and in a way a consequence of the war on terror. And to talk about all of this, we have an incredible group of panelists here. I really could talk about everything they've done for the next hour. I'll try not to. But they're truly some of the most crucial voices we have about what the US has created post 9/11 and what it has destroyed. I'll keep it as brief as I can, but we have Azmat Khan, who really needs no introduction at all, but is a Plury Award winner, investigative reporter, New York Times Magazine contributor, and director of the Lee Center for Global Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. For years, Azmat has exposed the US government's lies about the impact of its wars on civilians, most recently through the publication of the Civilian Casualties Files, thousands of pages of official records that Azmat fought to get for years that really showed the tragic, disastrous impact so-called precision strikes have had. Just this week, her work won an American Society of Magazine Editors Award. I think a week before that, it was the Overseas Press Club of America Award. But more important still than all of her many, many awards, I think is something that maybe less people know about her, that Azmat is an incredible mentor who really makes it a point to work with and empower younger journalists, who gives them credit, which is by no means a given in this industry, and who especially is a tireless advocate for the local journalists she works with. And I've been in many panels here in Perugia where we discussed the relationship between foreign media and the local reporters they so often rely on. And I think we can take Azmat's sense of commitment and responsibility to local journalists as one of her greatest lessons. Next, we have Spencer Ackerman, an independent journalist who has covered national security for publications like The New Republic, Wired, The Guardian, The Daily Beast, for pretty much the entire war on terror. He has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Guantanamo, He shared the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism for covering Snowden's NSA leaks for The Guardian, and has won a bunch of other awards, including the National Magazine Award. And most importantly, Spencer wrote what I think is the most essential book you can read about the War on Terror, Reign of Terror, which is this tour de force through the War on Terror that really looks at the ways in which the War on Terror both started in the United States and came home there, ultimately winning us the Trump presidency in 2016. Last but not least, we have my Intercept colleague, Murtaza Hussain, who has been at the Intercept from its founding and in many ways contributed to making the Intercept what it is today. Maz, as we call him, has covered pretty much every aspect of the War on Terror I can think of, from US wars abroad, US wars at home, civilian deaths in Afghanistan and Yemen, and on the US front, no-fly lists, surveillance campaigns, the disintegration of civil liberties, the FBI's efforts to recruit informants and the lengths to which they'll go to destroy their lives if they refuse. And one of the things I think that Maz has done best is reporting on the War on Terror, but beyond the kind of individual policy points of it or the individual crimes of it, really report on how the War on Terror has shaped our culture and our world order. And he somehow manages to do all of that while also being one of the most prolific writers I know, and often engaging in intellectual debates on Twitter, and I'll say the rare intellectual debates you actually want to be following on Twitter. And he reads books while walking. When we used to go to the office, I always saw Maz buried in a book, even though he had just published 3 stories that week, and 3 really insightful ones. So thank you all for being here. It is truly an honor, and particularly an honor for me to welcome you to Italy, my country. I want to start our discussion with maybe a bit of an unusual request, but I think we talk a lot about the War on Terror, and it's such a big, monstrous thing, this massive concept that we can't quite wrap our heads around, and we risk losing track of the fact that ultimately the War on Terror is about people, an uncounted number of people that were killed as a result of it, and countless people whose lives were in some way stolen or destroyed or upended by the War on Terror in many, many different ways. And I know each of you has come across many of these people in the course of your work, but I thought you could maybe start telling us the story of one person. Each of you share a story, tell us about who this person is or was, and what does this person's story tell us, at which part of the War on Terror does their story sort of highlight? And whoever wants to start, but we can go in this order, or however you guys want to do it.
I can start. I love that question. It is so important to think about people, and there are so many people whose stories have stayed with me, but I want to share one that came from my most recent work. And it is, a woman I met this past summer in June in Mosul, and I was there because I had a document that came from that cache of thousands of pages of documents that Alice mentioned in the civilian casualty files. And it was something I had fought to get for quite a while, and it detailed a civilian casualty incident, an admission from the US military that it had conducted an airstrike in early 2017 in Mosul that they believed had resulted in the death of one child. And the document described something that just was quite stunning to me. It described monitoring an ISIS bed-down location, a place where ISIS fighters slept, and starting to do the preparations to carry out an airstrike there. And the United States often boasts about having the most sophisticated process to prevent civilian casualties. And you really see that process play out in this document. It talks about how they monitored this, and before striking, they saw that there were 3 children on the roof of the house. And so they sent back this target to be reevaluated, and now the determination was made that this was no longer just an ISIS bed-down location. This was an ISIS weapons factory. They believed weapons were being manufactured there. And they note that they expected that 3 children might be killed in that strike, but that it would be proportional, it's a military term, or a sort of logic or rubric that the United States uses to assess the legitimacy and compliance with the rules of engagement, that the possible deaths of those 3 children would be proportional to the military advantage gained. So they carry out this strike, and they see people in the rubble, and they see a little girl, or they see a child, they say, being carried out and taken to the hospital, and they write up this report, and they say that ISIS media had noted something like 12 deaths or 11 deaths, and they moved on. And so I get to this location in Mosul where this strike apparently took place, and immediately people tell me that a civilian household was struck. And they describe how everyone in that household that was targeted was killed except for a little girl. And that next door, the house was also impacted by this strike, and a little girl was left permanently disabled. And they said, go and talk to that family, they're still here, they still live right next door. So I go to that family, and I meet a mother and father who both have injuries, and their daughter, who was only months old when the strike took place, who is permanently disabled, she lacks the capacity to sit up straight, or even be understood by most of her family members. She doesn't communicate or speak in a way that they understand. And I spent a little bit of time with them and asked them, what happened to the little girl next door who survived that airstrike? And they said, she now lives with her grandmother, who lives further down in this neighborhood. And I asked, why do you think that house was targeted? And they said, we have no idea why. This was a civilian family. There was an ISIS house across the street where ISIS fighters slept, but the house next door was filled with civilians. And so I go to the grandmother's house, and this is the woman I want to tell you about. Her name was Katia Ahmed. And I'm going to try to race through this because I think we're short on time, but also it's hard to talk about too much. But I asked her about her family, and she told me that night of the airstrike, she lost not just her daughter, who was her best friend, but her brother, her nephews and nieces, and some of her grandchildren. And that night, her family was planning on coming to her house for dinner, and they died without eating dinner. I proceeded to ask her a number of questions, and it was probably an hour and a half into our conversation before I finally gathered the nerve and asked her, told her that I have this document that describes a series of events, and asked her if she wanted to hear what that document said and offer any comments. And our subsequent conversation is one I will never forget. You can listen to it on an episode of The Daily. I'm afraid that, it was really having to walk someone through these complex law of war calculations that are made that give us so much faith and so much confidence in American warfare today, and to realize that intelligence can often be wrong, even when the military is presented with evidence otherwise, right? They saw 3 children, and rather than realizing that they had the wrong target, they now chose to classify it as an even more dangerous threat, something that would be proportional to the military advantage gained. And when I asked Katia about this, she said, I wish it was an ISIS weapons manufacturing facility, because then it would have been worth it to have done this. But there was no advantage. The only thing they did was kill the children. And, this is not a singular incident. I've found stories like this over and over and over. But to be able to take those calculations, have them in this form that is available to you, when the military so often tells you, we can't release this to you because it's classified, we can't give you these particular things. And to be able to give somebody who wanted answers that answer, and to be able to also show what that was like for her, watching her break down as she dealt with this, is something I will think about forever.
I also appreciate the question, and before I speak, I think it's important for us all to acknowledge that if not for Azmat, we would never know any of that. And that's something that I think I came to understand through interviewing in 2016 a young man who's about 21, 22 or so at the time, named Fahim Qureshi. And Fahim Qureshi, in January of 2009, was a 13-year-old boy who survived Barack Obama's first drone strike. And he experienced that on a day that was supposed to be really happy. His family in the tribal areas of Pakistan had come together because one of his uncles had come home from a real successful business trip to the United Arab Emirates. And as this family gathered together in a large communal house, Fahim basically had a long day. He had helped his mom shop. They had basically had just a lot to do to get the household ready for dinner, and that's when the drone struck. And Fahim was burned extremely badly. He lost an eye, and for the next 40 days of his life, he was in a coma. And I asked him to, not just walk me through that day, but what the impact that had on the rest of his life. And in that strike, most of Fahim's older male relatives were also killed. So once he got out of his hospital bed as a 13-year-old boy, now he had to be one of the family's main providers. So whatever he thought his life was going to be and the trajectory it was going to have and what it could end up producing all changed, and changed irrevocably. And he had to face that when he was 13 years old and had to perform whatever work his damaged body could perform. And what also he wanted to emphasize was that no one from the United States ever acknowledged that this happened. His family was, even though they had filed a lawsuit and they sought acknowledgement from the Pakistani government, from the United States, let alone recompense, but he couldn't find that anywhere through this apparatus that had led to this life-changing catastrophic event for him would even provide the basic dignity of saying that they had done it. He got thrown essentially a condolence payment, which is blood money, without any of the public acknowledgement that this had happened. And it underscored as well that this was an exceptional story because of how rarely journalists covering this business stuck around to tell it. And that is a process of obliteration.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to Alice and also Azmat and Spencer for your reporting, because likewise, we would never know these stories otherwise. And I'm very glad we're having this event because I think there's a lot of attempt to forget a lot of these things, and not forget it necessarily by suppression exactly, but by ignoring it or looking forward, not backward, as the way Barack Obama described it. But many of these issues are not just ongoing, but they've been systematized. And it's important to have some space to discuss this. So this is a very emotional question, actually. There's so many people I could pick from this, but I'm actually going to talk about somebody who was in the United States. There was the foreign war on terror, which Azmat and Spencer have covered very extensively, and also a domestic one, which is manifested in different ways. And there's one gentleman who I got to know very, very well over a course of a number of years. His name was Farik Duka. And he was an Albanian immigrant to the United States. He, in many ways, embodied what I would say was the immigrant dream in the U.S. He had 4 sons. He had a successful contracting business. They're a very working-class family. They managed to raise their kids, had a nice house in New Jersey, and so forth. When 9/11 happened in the U.S., there was a very significant change in the law enforcement tactics, in the cultural climate, the political climate. And what we began to see were a lot of terrorism cases manifesting in the U.S., and which I would say were of dubious quality in many cases. There was use very frequently of informants. An informant can mean many things. It could mean an undercover FBI agent. It could be somebody in a friend group of people who's paid to report certain things or given certain incentives to reporting what's being said to the FBI. And three of Farik's sons, three oldest sons, they had a pizza business in the neighborhood, and they were befriended by a guy in the neighborhood who they knew was a local Palestinian immigrant, who got to know them over the course of several months, up to a year. And this gentleman actually was working for the FBI, and he'd been tasked with the FBI. He had bad immigration status in the US, and he was told that you need to look for people who will talk to you and engage with you in conversations about terrorism or breaking the law and so forth. And he was instructed to go find people on a fishing expedition in his community, which is a very, very common tactic. So he started befriending these guys, Farik's sons. He got to know them. And over the course of 18 months, he found nothing, basically, in the conversations. He reported back to the FBI. And later we found this gentleman, this informant. He told us that I was telling the FBI the whole time that there's nothing with these guys. There's nothing going on here. Why am I still talking to them? They said, don't worry about it. Keep talking to them. Eventually, another guy who was not in their friend group, who knew them, eventually said something to this guy about breaking the law or responded to his entreaties about something to do with terrorism. But the three brothers never knew about this. In 2008, though, they were arrested in the FBI sting on their home, which was led by a very famous political figure in the US at the time. He was a prosecutor, Chris Christie, who later became the governor of New Jersey and highlighted this case as one of his shining moments of his career. And they were arrested, they were put on trial, and at that time in the US, there was a very hostile and unforgiving climate on issues like this, so close to 9/11, even more so than today, I would say. They were put on trial, they were accused of all these things, but there was not really any evidence that they had ever said anything or done anything, and they protested this very strongly. They were a poor family, they didn't have the money to hire an expensive lawyer. At the trial, after they were found guilty, the judge gave a very memorable statement. He said that they did not see much evidence against the defendants, but that didn't bother the jury, so it's not going to bother me either, and proceeded them to sentence them to life in prison without parole. So the three boys, Shane, El-Javir, and Jertan, they were sentenced to life in prison. They were sent to the harshest prison in the US, which is called ADX in Colorado. They're incommunicado 23 hours a day. The most stringent requirements of their living conditions. They don't see anybody, they don't see daylight most days. And they've been there the entire time, despite the case, which we investigated the Intercept later on and proved, I'd say, to a high degree of, as much as you can prove a negative, that they were not only were they innocent, there was never any evidence, and we even got the informant to tell us that to this day he believes that they're innocent. And I got to know Farik very well in this case because, his life was basically, his whole life was his kids, and he had three boys. He was an older man, maybe he was like his early 60s. He was ready to die happy that he'd raise his kids in America after coming from Albania. But then after they went to jail, his whole life plans had kind of gotten awry. He had a very fatalistic, and he was so hospitable to us. He was very kind. For maybe 2 years, we came to his house, talked to him all the time. And he told me that, I don't want anything else. I just want to see my sons free one last time, and I can die happy. I just want to see them one more time, and then I can die and leave the world. And unfortunately, Farik did die in 2019. He passed away, and he never got to see his sons free. So I think about him a lot, and I think about him when I see Chris Christie, of course, because he still talks about this case as one of the great accomplishments of his career. And because there's so much, I'd say, surface level thinking and discussion about these issues and these cases, even what Azmat and Spencer were talking about, this term collateral damage and this sort of justification and, just sort of a very, very lack of looking at the actual, what makes up the granularity of these issues. He gets away with that. He talks about it as though it's a great political victory. He still extracts political benefits from that. And yet, the family he destroyed and Farik's life he destroyed, it's over. And he actually undermined one of the best things about the United States, which is a place a lot of immigrants can come and build life for themselves. But his sons were sacrificed to political exigencies at the moment, and they're still in jail today. So I think about Farik a lot, and there are many, many people I could talk about. He's just one case of so many people we could discuss. But, it's definitely the most emotionally resonant one that I still reflect on today.
Thank you. I also want to very briefly add one case of my own. I wrote a story last year about a young man, Ahmed Rabbani from Karachi, Pakistan, who told me that when he was 12, he went online and he looked up the Wikipedia page for the Guantanamo Bay U.S. military prison in Cuba and printed it out, and his English was not very good. So with a dictionary, he looked up the words he didn't know to try to understand what this thing was. And around the same time, he also saw a Bollywood film, I think it was called New York, about a guy who gets accused of terrorism in the aftermath of 9/11, and gets arrested, and there is a waterboarding scene in the film. And so Jawad, who again was 12 at the time, became obsessed with torture and spent much of his early teens looking up videos of torture techniques online, which, if you haven't done that, there are a lot of demonstrations of torture online, and he kind of became obsessed with this thing. And the reason for that is that before he was born, in 2002, his father, who was a taxi driver in Pakistan named Ahmed Rabbani, was arrested and transferred to US custody, accused of being a terrorist. He was held at a CIA black site in Afghanistan for 2 years, where he was tortured, and he was sent to Guantanamo. Even though years ago, the US government acknowledged that they actually had the wrong guy, and that the person who they're looking for was someone else, and they actually killed that person in a drone strike, Ahmed Rabbani is still at Guantanamo. Last year, he was cleared for release, but he is still at Guantanamo. And Jawad Rabbani, who is 19 now, has never met his father. And so I often think about this story to kind of, think of the ripple effects around war, that the collateral damage, so to speak, extends so wide and so far, and this war has impacted so many people in so many different ways. So this image of this child looking up Guantanamo on Wikipedia or Googling videos of torture really kind of, to me, it shows, this is a kid trying to understand what we did, in the name of the war on terror. And this actually brings me to my next question. I went to a panel a couple of days ago here about the war in Ukraine, and there was a question from the audience that was about whataboutism, right? Russia is committing war crimes, but what about the US? What about the Iraq war? What about torture, Abu Ghraib? What about drone strikes? And it wasn't the kind of, sometimes disingenuous, like, what about question that you get from certain elements in Europe and in the US. It was a question framed from the perspective of somebody who's been a victim of US crimes. And so, while of course that justifies absolutely nothing of what Russia is doing today, I think it raises a question that people who have been critical of the war on terror and have warned about for years, and that is that if the US remains unaccountable for its crimes, which it has so far, then we're creating a culture of impunity, and then somebody else can take that and go on and commit new atrocities, the same atrocities, and start their own wars on terror, and that's our legacy, right? And I think a lot of people kind of, around the 9/11 anniversary last September, which was the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, I think that and the fact that the US pulled its troops out of Afghanistan just 2 weeks before, there was this sense that this is, a closed chapter of our history. This is over, we're done, let's move on. And first of all, I think that's, obviously just not the case. But also, there is this question of impunity. We have never actually reckoned with any of it. And so, just thinking about the fact that the last US military action in Afghanistan was a drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 people, including many children, all of them absolutely innocent of anything. And there has been no consequence for that. There has been no consequence for pretty much any of the previous strikes. So I guess my question is, how does that impunity shape where we are now and shape all of our other conflicts?
If I may start, just because this is something that I think is so important, I imagine there are so many journalists in this room who are looking for ways to cover this beat, and I think there's so much coverage that is necessary right now. Think of it this way: the United States wrote a playbook after 9/11 that other countries have borrowed. We can look back at the Sri Lankan Civil War, which killed as many as 200,000 civilians in a span of a very short few months. And the government of Sri Lanka justified it on the basis that they were going after terrorists. And so the United States and Westerners who would have otherwise perhaps pushed back on this war didn't really have enough means to make that argument. In 2020, the New York Times published the Xinjiang papers, which looked at, it obtained papers, leaked papers from the Chinese government that essentially revealed explicitly that they were going to borrow the US playbook after 9/11 to justify mass internment and what has been happening to Uyghurs, the systemic oppression of a minority population in their country on that basis, which again, then gave it leeway. More recently, obviously, you've seen similar invocations in Myanmar, and you can expect this, as countries like Russia are perhaps pushing disinformation campaigns that also rely on similar rhetoric about terrorism, you can expect this to continue. And I think it's that playbook that is so entrenched globally that is incredibly important. That's one thing. The second thing that I think is also extremely important is that it's not just about, the war crimes that the United States may have committed and that we might look the other way at, which is essential, right? The United States has actively prevented the investigation of war crimes, something that Alice has written about really well very recently. In Afghanistan, they prevented it actively so there would be no international investigation into these allegations. So there are these allegations, they exist, and the US media for a long time has not given it the same kind of authority or weight, perhaps when they pull a video out of Ukraine that might show carnage towards civilians. They do not necessarily give that same weight when videos surface in Syria or Iraq. And I'm saying this as somebody who's been on the ground investigating a lot of these, and particularly in Afghanistan, I've seen that to be the case. But what I would also tell you is that there is a new approach to how the United States wages wars, in which it largely now outsources many of these practices that itself has declared it's abandoned to foreign partners. There's a program, 127 ECHO, which really crystallizes this reliance on foreign partners in the furtherance of US missions. And that is happening everywhere around the world. And I often liken this to people like to call Obama the drone president. And they think of the Obama doctrine in terms of foreign policy to really switch things to drones. But I think that's a very surface level look at this. The real change he made was retaining a lot of these practices, just perhaps not the United States doing it, or taking away the political costs of conducting these. So for example, detention became extremely controversial, right? Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, the impacts of that so adversely impacted the United States that he made the decision to stop it. But what did he do instead? There is a political calculation that was made that it is easier and less political costly to target and kill people in airstrikes than it is to detain them, prosecute them, and put them to justice for the crimes or alleged crimes that they are accused of. And so, that kind of outsourcing, that is also something that you can see. It's not just other governments that are borrowing that playbook, but it is many of these governments hiring contractors, hiring other partner forces who engage in these abuses while those who are asking them to do it look the other way.
I made an enormous mistake by letting Azmat speak first because there's just really very little I can contribute beyond that. A few points. Right after 9/11, months after 9/11, as the war on terror was coalescing, the George W. Bush administration made a very fateful decision, one that was preordained by certain ideological commitments, to take the United States out of the Rome Treaty that the Clinton administration had toothlessly agreed to in the final year of Bill Clinton's presidency. The reason for this, it's amazing to look back on some of the coverage now because it is, remarkably both covered in euphemism, but also free from it in a certain sense, because the administration simply explained that it didn't want to have the ICC empowered to investigate American war crimes. And so when President Biden talks about Vladimir Putin being a war criminal and Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine, it is impossible not to look at the images coming out of Ukraine and not immediately see that to be true. And also see in that same breath, and I think it's very important for us to look at both of these things in symbiosis rather than in the oppositional framework that we so often are both expected to look at and as reporters frame for people to encourage to look at, that the United States had destroyed an institutional mechanism that could have lent legitimacy to adjudicating actual war crimes like the ones that, in this case, its adversary prevented, but instead created a legacy of impunity that undermined what the United States likes to call the rules-based international order and revealed it to be an adjunct of American power and nurturing, I think, understandably and justifiably, the cynicism that much of the rest of the world greets it when the United States talks about an adversary nation or movement committing these sorts of atrocities, and the atrocities are real, and humanity is poorer for what the United States has done. Finally, Vladimir Putin told you this himself in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference speech that we talk about, endlessly in the American media, but I wonder if, how deeply we've engaged with it, not as a way to justify what unjustifiable acts Putin has committed, but in the way he laid out, in a manner very offensive to the United States at the time, that the wages of the United States' impunity and the way it had wrecked an international order that it postured as acting to save was now manifest around the world. And what I think Putin's apologists have taken away from that speech is not what Putin took away from that speech, which is not, and this was initially a posture that Putin put himself toward, that Putin and Putin's Russia will be a rampart against these acts by the United States, when instead what Putin was saying is, we want that too. We want what you've done. We want exactly what you've just put out with the justifications of its necessity for the international order. And we're reaping the consequences of that.
Okay, there's a very limited amount I can add to the smartest people in the world just asking this question on this subject. But I will say one thing, that the question of whataboutism, it's very interesting because, on one hand, there's an argument that, if we very much focus on all the terrible things we've done, then do we have the right to criticize somebody else doing something bad? And I think that there is, but I do think that if you look in context, there's a very big tragedy that we're finally seeing the consequences of, illustrated very starkly, which is that after the Bush administration, the Obama administration came to power, there was a very polarizing 8 years in the US, wars had been undertaken, torture, institutionalized, all these things. And there was a very calculated political decision domestically to not prosecute past bad acts, brazen bad acts which had taken place. Now, this was, I think, a turning point in American history and contemporary world history, because it basically said that this very appealing and morally admirable idea of a liberal world order, a rules-based order where there were rules between nations, international human rights standards, very, very admirable goals, there was a great falsity to it, and it was illustrated by the decision. And we've seen this over the years too. People who were involved in torture, very highly criminal acts by any normal view of it, have not only remained in American politics, have been promoted, they've risen in their careers. People have not just had impunity, they've been fallen up very much for these acts. So when Vladimir Putin says this, who absolutely is a war criminal, absolutely is involved in war crimes today, which must be condemned and prevented and so forth, there's undeniably a grain of truth to it. And even if this argument does not carry that far in the US, we see in other countries, there has not been a great sense of unity on this subject. Outside of the US and Europe, you see many other countries representing billions of people who've taken a much more equivocal stance about this, because there's not really a moral argument to be made in the sense. They have a point. There's not a moral argument because you can very much justly claim, well, the other side does the same thing when it's convenient to them. They commit war crimes with impunity, they kill civilians and so forth when it's convenient to them. So what's the moral argument here? And if there's not a moral argument, let's calculate very clearly what our economic interests or political interests here are, because there's nothing else to aspire to. We're not aspiring to a liberal world order. We're not aspiring to a world where nations can't menace other nations, or that torture and killing civilians we're on some teleology to eliminate or to regulate very harshly. No, there's none of that. It's just what are your interests. It's a very, very realism-based world, and we're seeing that now. So India is a country, 1.2 billion people. In many senses, they're viewed as the hope. They have been viewed as the hope of the US and other countries to help establish a rules-based order in Asia. They're not interested in this at all. They're very closely inside with Russia on this subject. China as well, many, many other countries. So after that decision, after that inflection point in 2008, it takes time for things to manifest. We're now seeing the terrible fruit, growing of that decision to institutionalize impunity in the United States and underline for all its detractors that no, the rules-based order and everything underpinned it, all these words, institutions, they're just words. They're just words, and when it's necessary, they'll be cast about. I hope that's not the case. I hope that somehow we see a resurgence of it, or we see, some level of meaningful accountability which changes people's perspective, but it's hard to blame people for concluding as such.
I just want to jump in quickly to just state that the coverage we're seeing coming out of Ukraine right now is so heroic and brave and courageous and horrifying, right? The images out of Bucha, I'd really recommend Louisa Lovelock and the Washington Post team's recent reporting on the ground there, which is just horrifying. But also the New York Times' visual investigations team, which has been using open source intelligence techniques in OSINT tools to verify a lot of the misinformation about a lot of the crimes against civilians that are currently happening. And for those journalists in this room who maybe aren't prepared to go into a war zone, that's also a great avenue, I think, to make meaningful contributions to this conflict. And the point I want to make about this is that, we've seen these horrifying images and videos get verified about attacks on hospitals, about an attack on a maternity ward. And I just want to also tell you that one of the original reasons that I began my reporting on airstrikes and went to Iraq, and I remember because I pulled up for the course I teach the other day, the original pitch I wrote. It was about an airstrike on a maternity ward in Hawija, Iraq, conducted by the Iraqi Air Force, which was supported by the United States, in which you could see bottles in the rubble, you could see babies, you could see a lot of these same images that we are now seeing coming out of Ukraine. And it was, verified and talked about by Doctors Without Borders and a few NGOs, but it never, ever reached mainstream press. And that happened again and again. There were many hospitals that were struck, but, in the documents I've obtained, they're no longer considered hospitals if they're not being used as hospitals anymore. This is now a facility used to manufacture weapons by ISIS or whatever it might be. There's a very different legal framing around some of these issues, and I would really encourage you to look a little bit more deeply because a lot of these kinds of attacks on civilians, it's different obviously when there are troops on the ground beheading people. But with respect to airstrikes specifically, I've seen a lot of similarities in terms of the impacts of what those strikes have been having on the ground.
Yep, jump right
in 2010, the United States Army in Kandahar in Afghanistan wiped 3 villages off the map. They no longer exist. I interviewed the lieutenant colonel who ordered what was essentially 25 tons of bombs onto these villages, and his argument was that they weren't villages anymore. They were enormous daisy-chained IED factories and booby traps where the people had all been forced to flee by the Taliban, and they had been transformed into something that only existed to kill Americans and Afghans allied with them. And he said to me as he was, we were ending this interview, his name is David Flynn, no relations to Mike or Charlie. He said that, if, those villages weren't rebuilt in a year, then that would really, he tends, like in many cases of people who I've interviewed who have done things like that, the if statement is there and then the then statement kind of trails off. But as far as I'm aware, those villages don't exist anymore. And imagine if that had been covered the way we cover Ukraine and the way our colleagues are covering Ukraine, as Azmat says, very heroically. And the difference in what you are both allowed to and encouraged to cover in American journalism and the language with which you can do it, the resources devoted to following up on it, so that the initial statement you get when, as people on this panel know, every 6 months there's, I don't need to tell Azmat Khan this, there's an after-action airstrike digest released by US Central Command, and it's just words on paper, and the most bloodless words possible, and usually some of the least truthful. And imagine the world that we might be living in right now if that wasn't the way, by and large, our journalistic institutions allowed the United States government to have acted these past 20 years.
I want to add quickly too, actually, it is good that we're seeing this coverage in Ukraine, and it's so heartfelt and so intense. And that information, as Azmat reports so thoroughly, and Spencer, you report, it's out there. And if you be elevated to the same level or given the same level of public attention, you can see consistency, you can rebuild the credibility and so forth. Because there actually is a very strong argument that we should respond harshly, and we should never be any country menacing another country in the sense of Iraq and the US or Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine is happening today, it can still be stopped. So the cynicism, I don't think that we can be surrendered to it, it can always be rebuilt. And it's always something you can do. You can always raise reporting that's taking place now. You can always report more heavily. There can be a public outcry about it. And perceptions can change. And every generation learns things anew again. So if we're cynical because you grew up in the War on Terror era or the 2001, post-2001 era, there's still kids being born today who are young and having their worldview shaped. And if they see that all lives are being treated as though they're equal and a killing in Iraq or Afghanistan is as heinous as a killing in Ukraine as we're seeing today, then they'll learn to treat the world that way as well, too.
I'm glad you guys started talking about the role of media from our failures, which I would say have been many over the last 20 years. I mean, some obvious ones, like the fact that the Iraq War was predicated on the existence of weapons of mass destruction that we know were not there. But I guess the question there is not so much how did we fail, although by all means please address that too, but why did we fail? And since we were kind of low on time, I'm going to combine that with one of the questions that came in from somebody in the audience. Which is thinking about how the war in Ukraine is being covered now. I'm going to cut it, but it seems the media at large still does not appreciate the extent to which internal forces, both government and parastatal institution, are tilted toward intervention and militarism. Is that your impression? And what mistakes are being replicated today? And that's a lot of questions, but take what you will.
No, you guys go for it, please. I insist.
Do you want to answer?
It's a very hard question.
It's a very interesting and distinct situation because the last 20 years we kind of got used to seeing the US as the sole superpower aggressor in the world. There was a pattern of behavior which we saw. There were still other conflicts taking place. Russia had attacked several other countries, including Ukraine, during this time. But we gotten used to seeing the world a certain way. And now we see that other countries can engage in as heinous or even worse aggression in certain cases. They can kill civilians. And I don't think that we can't live in a world that's completely pacific or peaceful at the moment because it's just not set up that way. I don't think that you can respond peacefully to aggression, which could potentially be halted. So I don't think that, it's very hard because I don't think that you necessarily have to have a non-militaristic response in every case. Sometimes it can be appropriate. But this question, I think the root of it is very understandable because you saw 20 years of not just militaristic foreign policy and so forth, but a lot of militarism which did not need to be. It was not necessary, it was aggressive, it was by choice, and it imprinted the idea there was a moral fatigue and general fatigue with these sort of policies in general. So, but unfortunately the world will continue happening. There's going to be more attacks against countries in Eastern Europe in the future. There's going to be probably wars in Asia that the US and Western countries have an interest in. And it's unfortunate because there's so much understandable cynicism about this now that it's hard to believe it when the US says, okay, we're on the right side of this at this moment. And it could be the case. I think it's a very strong moral argument it's the case in this case. But I understand this question for that reason because if you grew up in this era, you're very, very used to seeing militarism which is counterproductive, which is unnecessary, which was by choice. And when you're confronted with a situation that could be different, it requires some additional effort to view it that way.
After 9/11, the United States, in its journalistic institutions, in its political institutions certainly, and very often in its academics institutions, said that the story started then, that none of the history of the United States' violent and exploitative domination of the Middle East was relevant to that story, that was Osama bin Laden propaganda and apologism. And throughout the course of the weeks and months after 9/11, there was a very rapid move to an incredibly censorious culture, a very self-censorious culture, something that always puts a smile on my face when I hear talk about today's cancel culture, because it just imagine steamrollers rolling over CDs by the most popular country music act there is because of an exceptionally mild criticism of George W. Bush, of a titan of American literature like Susan Sontag, hounded until she died 3 years later, because very mildly, 10 days after 9/11, she wrote about how there is a historical context for this attack that the United States proved for so long, and I think still to this day, that it was not willing to listen to, that aggression is not something the United States does, it's something the United States confronts, something the United States reacts to. Why is that? Central to the United States' self-conception, and this is true for a variety of historical and material reasons, as well as religious reasons, from dating back to the establishment of the original settler colonialist enterprise that would become the United States of America, is the idea of exceptionalism. The idea that America, I think exceptionalism is understood kind of weirdly in America, that usually in American political discourse, it's a statement about America's righteousness, and it's a statement about America's democratic institutions that have emerged over time and sort of lit a path forward for the rest of civilization. That's how it talks about it. But it also means something else, something more material and something more germane to this discussion, which is really what it says on the package, which is that the United States is not bound by virtue of its power to the rules that it sets for the rest of the world, that the United States is exceptional in that sense, that it acts, it is not acted upon. And as we have seen, I think, not just in the context of the war on terror, but certainly in the context of the war on terror, and that comes very clear in contradistinction when we look at aggression committed by powers that are hostile to the United States. This is the case for Iran too, and is the case for China increasingly more so. We hear today that now China, as the consequence of this new Cold War, is accelerating its nuclear weapons development. That's a really terrifying thing that shows the wages of what we're doing, but it demonstrates that the United States has an enormous problem that we as journalists have to be attentive to in every story we tell about these subjects, that we don't portray the United States as emerging innocently into the world and acting in a manner that categorically cannot be understood as aggressive because it is the United States of America. One of the most dangerous legacies of the war on terror is that the United States redefined evil not as something that people do, but as something that some people are.
I just want to quickly make two recommendations. One is something to read and one is something to watch. Recently, the Columbia Journalism Review did an oral history with reporters who'd covered Afghanistan. Full disclosure, I'm in it, but I wanted to call out some of the other reporters who basically reflected on some of the responses they got from their editors when they tried to pitch more stories or write more stories about civilian casualties and the impact these were having. And one reporter basically says the equivalent of, there just wasn't an appetite to keep publishing this because we would get treated like, why are you not supporting this war? Why are you being so negative about our future prospects here? And that's really an essential kind of aspect to understand when thinking about editorial priorities and what journalists got wrong. But I think it's more deeply rooted in scoop culture and just how entrenched the U.S. news media became in being deferential to the answer is classified, or we have information you don't. There's someone in this room who I think wrote a really powerful self-reflection on that, Vanessa Gazzari. I think it was in the Columbia Journalism Review, and talking about what detainees had told her that, if I'm remembering correctly, and forgive me if I'm not, but what detainees, people who'd been captured and tortured, had told her. And, they described, I think, sound torture and other methods that she felt like she couldn't corroborate and just print because of the climate and editors and priorities, and later on turned out to be true. And it's a very powerful piece. I would read it. But also News Wars, a frontline documentary that documents the lead up to the Iraq War and how a lot of it was tied up in a war for scoops. And these journalists who were fighting one another to say that they had particular kinds of reporting. And if you watch it, you would be surprised by some of your journalistic heroes who are in it admitting some very sad realities. But it's, so much is set by editors and editorial priorities, and so much of that is entrenched in our way of thinking. And there's one more book I want to recommend that I know others here have recommended as well, in addition to Reign of Terror. It's a little bit more academic. It's called Disciplining Terror, and it looks at the sort of rise of our conceptions of terrorism and what that means. And it's a really powerful look at how that logic, that rubric, the creation of terrorism reporters or a terrorism beat, the creation of national security reporters, who are largely driven by access to sources, can really mar the kind of coverage that we ultimately wind up producing. And to me, it's something to even say that comes with costs in this industry. To say that a national security bureau or national security reporters can, while making essential contributions, right, can also have a harmful effect is something that is just not easy for a lot of institutions to reckon with.
You guys have 2 minutes left. There are 3-4 questions from the audience. I had a few more, and we're just not going to get to all of them. I'm sorry, but I think maybe we can just end it on your parting thoughts and in 90 seconds each, if we can go over time a little bit. Possiamo sforare un po'? No? Okay, 3 minutes.
I'll be very quickly. I just wanted to thank, again, all you for coming out for a very particular reason, that because, this era, we're kind of moving past it in a way. You said it's been institutionalized in some sense, but the crises are moving to different parts of the world. The emergency that's being depicted is it's gravitating away from the Middle East, away from the Muslim majority countries where it was focused. But the consequences of this era are still unaddressed. There's still things which could be ameliorated or addressed. There's still people who are alive today who are in prison, like Farik Duka's sons who are still in prison. There's a Sundance documentary we made about this film. You can watch it. You can advocate for them. You can still ameliorate some of the bad things that happened. And we can still have accountability that could make things better, that can make it easier to have a coalition to confront injustice in the future by showing we're consistent about the past. What's happened has been terrible in many ways. We've witnessed horrible things over the past 20 years. But there's not cause for nihilism or despair. There's no time for that. There's still things we can do to fix it, to make the world better, to give justice to those who've lost so much, and rebuild our own moral credibility for the future.
We make a very deep mistake, and we do it at our peril when we talk about the war on terror as being over, particularly in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are right now 2,500 American troops in Iraq. There's no war in Iraq, fundamentally, from the perspective, not fundamentally, formally, from the perspective of the United States. But the posture of the United States is, of course, in Iraq, still one that can scale up that war as necessary. Institutionally, the war on terror exists as powerfully as it did after 9/11 and after the election of Barack Obama. The institutional authorities remain. Someone who ran a black site, a torturer, was confirmed as CIA director. All of these things are with us. They're not with us just, as Maz said, and I don't disagree with anything you said, in terms of the consequences, because the consequences are so profound. By the estimation of the Costs of War Project at Brown University, and this is a very conservative analytic formulation that doesn't take into account epidemiological research, the war on terror has killed 930,000 people. Tens of millions of people are refugees. This is ongoing. And unless the institutional architectures and authorities of it are broken, it will continue. And we can't talk about it, as I think a lot of very powerful politicians, particularly those within the Democratic Party, for reasons of their own complicity, like a page turned after, first they said, the 9/11 is era after, COVID ended it. The 9/11 era is over because of January 6th. The 9/11 era is over, and I don't even know that they really say this so, much, because of Ukraine or the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Every single time the United States has had to retrench somewhat in the war on terror, it's retrenched as little as possible, and it tends to maintain the ability, as we saw from the ISIS war, to scale back up and to reverse what looks like an invisibility of it. But it's just become this firmware almost, and that needs to, in our journalistic presentations, have to, not just come up when anniversaries happen.
If you had told me in 2010 that I would be on a panel with Spencer Ackerman, I would have lost my mind. And I say that not just to compliment you, because you've always been, so much of your work has been such an inspiration, but for any journalists in the audience who felt maybe like I did, that reporting on the war on terror was out of your reach, I hope you know that it's not. And there's so many ways in, and that hopefully at this conference that you're seeing a lot of resources for that, but I'm always happy to talk as well. And so if you'd like to embark on this route, I'm more than happy to try to offer any advice.
Thank you guys so much. Really, you are all such an inspiration. I'm so grateful to you all for being here. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. Sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions. Have a good night.